Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're stepping into the story of a man who didn't look like danger because he understood exactly how to look like everything except danger. Glen Rogers, tall, charming, flirtatious, and unforgettable. He walked into bars and motel lobbies like someone worth falling for. A smile here, a compliment there, a drink placed gently on the table. He didn't force his way into people's lives. He invited himself in, and they welcomed him. That's what made him so frightening. He didn't lurk in the shadows. He didn't stalk like a predator. He looked like romance, comfort, excitement, until the moment trust turned into terror. Long before Florida knew his name, Rogers had been drifting across states, collecting broken relationships, sudden disappearances, and crime scenes that didn't make sense until someone connected them all. The newspapers called him the Casanova Killer, a man who used affection as bait and seduction as a weapon. Tonight, we're going to walk quietly through the life that shaped him, the patterns that defined him, the murders that haunted the country, and the manhunt that finally ended his dangerous charm. Before we begin, drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. This late-night true crime family stretches across the world, and I'm glad you're here. Now settle in, let the day fade, and follow me into the calm, unsettling story of a man who made people feel chosen, right before he made them disappear. This is True Crime Records, and if you're new here, make sure to subscribe. There's a new story waiting for you every night. Chapter 1. The Making of a Drifter, Childhood, Charm, and Early Cracks. Glen Rogers did not begin life as the smooth-talking wanderer who could captivate a room with nothing more than a grin. Long before the tabloids called him the Casanova Killer, long before Florida whispered his name with fear, he was simply a boy growing up in a world that never felt steady. His childhood unfolded like a story stitched together with uncertainty, small towns, cramped apartments, and a family fighting silently against poverty and emotional instability. Glen was one of many children, lost somewhere in the middle, never quite the star and never quite forgotten, floating in the chaotic rhythm of a home that shifted constantly. What people remembered most from those early days wasn't misbehavior or defiance, but his charisma. Even as a child, Glen knew how to win people over, how to make adults smile, how to read moods in a room and adjust himself like a mirror to whatever someone wanted. Teachers remembered him as bright when he tried, playful when he didn't, and skilled in the little social tricks children rarely master so young. But beneath that charm was a growing hunger, not for attention alone, but for acceptance, validation, and admiration. When Glen felt valued, he flourished. When he didn't, he unraveled. Childhood became the first stage where that split personality took shape. The affectionate boy who glowed under praise and the resentful boy who shut down when approval faded. As he grew into adolescence, the divide widened. His family dynamic was not gentle or predictable. Arguments simmered beneath the surface, and Glen learned early that emotions could be used like currency: attention, guilt, affection, anger. He was smart enough to see what worked and bold enough to test it. If kindness didn't win him what he sought, he shifted to manipulation. If manipulation failed, he drifted away completely. His teen years became a pattern of running, from school to school, from house to house, from job to job, always in search of something that felt like belonging, always moving on once the excitement wore off. Friends came easily, because Glen knew exactly how to make people feel important. But friends faded just as easily, because once they couldn't give him the validation he craved, he simply slipped into new circles, reinventing himself as needed. Stories of his teenage identity varied depending on who you asked. Some remembered him as shy and troubled, others as wild and magnetic. Both were true. He lived like liquid, taking the shape of whatever space he entered. Relationships became his anchor and his addiction. He discovered that romance, or the illusion of romance, unlocked doors that friendship never could. Compliments flowed naturally from him, so easily that people didn't realize how deliberately crafted they were. Glen never simply liked someone. He made them feel adored, chosen, seen in a way that caught them off guard. But affection came paired with volatility. The moment he sensed rejection or loss of control, everything shifted. 1 minute warmth, the next distance. 1 minute laughter, the next storm clouds. Those who dated him in youth later remembered the same pattern in haunting detail. He wasn't aggressive at first, just intense, fast, and consuming. Like a whirlwind relationship that burned through bright, messy passion and then collapsed just as quickly as it started. He lived in emotional extremes, and he expected the people in his life to keep up. Adulthood didn't bring reliability, it brought mobility. Glen realized he didn't need a foundation to survive. He could live from place to place, job to job, couch to couch, and bar to bar simply by being liked. A new town meant a new version of himself. In one place he was an artist, in another a handyman, in another a devoted boyfriend, in another a guy just passing through who left behind phone numbers, charm, and empty promises. His skill wasn't in lying outright. It was in saying what people hoped to hear, wearing whatever emotional costume the moment called for. That ability became the key to his life. When people felt safe around him, doors opened, rooms opened, wallets opened, hearts opened. But every rush of belonging faded quickly, and the emptiness afterward gnawed at him stronger each time. He wanted connection, but he wanted control more. He wanted stability, but he never learned how to stay. By his mid-20s, the pattern had become unmistakable. Glen didn't root himself anywhere for long, not because he couldn't, but because staying forced people to see beyond the charm. He felt safest when someone saw only the version he wanted them to see. The attractive stranger with stories, dreams, and a grin that felt like a secret. In reality, he didn't know who he was without the performance. He could be whoever someone needed him to be, until he couldn't maintain the act anymore. A friend once described him not as troubled or dangerous, but simply as a man who always seemed to be running, even when standing still. That description became the blueprint for the life he would live. Every city Glen passed through, every relationship he entered, every couch he slept on, every woman who felt lucky to catch his attention, they were all brief stops on a path he didn't control anymore. Long before the headlines, long before the wanted posters, long before Florida branded him the Casanova Killer, Glen Rogers was already walking a tightrope between charm and danger. The foundations of his future weren't built in a single moment, but brick by brick. The emotional instability, the craving to be adored, the fear of abandonment, the belief that affection could be manipulated rather than earned, and the constant practice of slipping into new identities without hesitation. The most chilling part of his early life is not that he was cruel or violent, but that he learned how to make people trust him without effort. That skill made him popular, desirable, magnetic. Years later, that same skill would make him deadly. But here, at the beginning, there was no smoke, no alarms, just a boy who understood how to get people to love him, and a man who leaned on that power more than anything else. The world saw a charmer. The danger was that Glen saw himself that way too. Chapter 2. The Drifter's Charm. Bars, motels, and new names. When Glen Rogers left his childhood behind, he didn't carry luggage, certificates, or keepsakes. He carried a talent. The same charm that helped him survive in school and through unstable family dynamics became the ticket that sustained him through adulthood. His 20s arrived not with structure or ambition, but with motion. He became a man who lived on the road, slipping through cities like a character who never belonged to any setting for long. Most people spend their young years rooting themselves, building careers, forming friendships that feel permanent. Glen did the opposite. He drifted, floated, adapted, and disappeared. If life was a stage, he was its most convincing performer. Wherever he arrived, he made sure his entrance mattered. A warm handshake, an easy laugh, a story that sounded impressive but unprovable, a hint of mystery that kept people leaning closer. It didn't matter whether the town was small or large, whether the bar was dive or upscale. Glen knew how to walk in like someone worth knowing. And when someone is interesting enough, people rarely ask questions. His pattern became so consistent, it was almost mathematical. Glen would arrive in a new city with the confidence of a local and the curiosity of a traveler. He would find a place where people gathered, bars, clubs, pool halls, roadside diners, and position himself exactly where attention naturally flowed. He never looked lost or desperate for company. Instead, he waited until people approached him. He understood the psychology of a room. Who was lonely, who wanted excitement, who was drinking away problems, who needed validation most. And he tailored himself to the person in front of him. If someone wanted adventure, he spoke about the places he'd seen. If someone wanted comfort, he said he understood their pain. If someone wanted romance, he mirrored their energy with a magnetic softness. He didn't just charm women, he charmed everyone. Men shook his hand, bartenders remembered him, and strangers felt like they had known him for years after a single night of conversation. Glen had a way of learning everything about others while revealing almost nothing about himself. Money was always short, which forced him to sharpen his act even more. When Glen needed a place to stay, he didn't beg. He made people want to offer. Friends let him crash on couches. Girlfriends gave him keys. Owners of small motels offered discounts because he just seemed like a good guy. Every new connection became an opportunity. Every opportunity became temporary stability. And every time someone opened their home to him, they also opened their personal life, their meals, their time, and their trust. Glen didn't have to take. People willingly handed him what he wanted. But beneath the calm voice and playful confidence, something else had begun to surface, a dependency on admiration. If someone's attention began to fade, Glen responded first with charm, then with insecurity, and finally with distance. He couldn't tolerate feeling unimportant. He couldn't tolerate silence. And rather than face emotional discomfort, he ran. New city, new bar, new personality, new chance to be adored. But something more dangerous was developing in the background. Alcohol began shaping his evenings, not as an escape, but as a companion to his persona. Drinking loosened the edges of his charm and dulled whatever guilt he might have felt about leaving messes behind. New girlfriends blamed themselves when emotional storms hit. Friends felt confused when Glen suddenly turned cold. Each time someone suggested he slow down, he laughed it off with the casualness of a man who saw the world as temporary. What unsettled people most, though they couldn't explain it at the time, was the way he could be so affectionate one moment and so distant the next, as if he could detach from people instantly, erasing them without emotion. That emotional detachment, invisible at first, became the core of the life he was building. Law enforcement never paid attention to Glen during those early drifting years because nothing obvious connected the stops on his journey. He kept his legal trouble minor, bar fights, unpaid tabs, disappearing before rent was due. Nothing that triggered major investigation. He was too charming to be considered a threat and too mobile to be tracked. There were girlfriends who swore he loved them, families who welcomed him for dinner, friends who said he was a little wild, but a good guy. And although breakups were dramatic, nothing about his early relationships raised alarms for authorities. Glen looked young, handsome, and carefree, exactly the kind of man who seemed like danger only in hindsight. His siblings later recalled this phase of his life with conflicting emotions. They admired his confidence, but worried about his aimlessness. Some saw him as charismatic, others as unstable, but none of them saw what he was becoming. A few family gatherings turned tense, Glen's temper flaring for reasons no one could understand, apologies arriving too quickly to feel sincere. But after each uncomfortable moment, he would disappear again, leaving nothing behind but stories of where he might be next. One sibling described him best. You never knew which version of Glen would walk through the door. There were nights he was the life of the party, and nights he walked in like a different person altogether. And still, the world welcomed him. Doors kept opening. Women kept falling for him. Strangers kept trusting him. Because there was no outward sign of how distorted his inner world had become. He learned early that love could be weaponized, and by now he believed that affection was something he could earn instantly, withdraw instantly, and replace instantly. Emotional turbulence followed him everywhere, but he stayed ahead of it by traveling and reinventing himself faster than consequences could catch up. By the time Glen approached his 30s, he was no longer simply a drifter. He was a man building a life around seduction and control. What started as a survival skill in childhood had now become his entire identity. Relationships weren't partnerships to him anymore. They were arenas to prove his worth, to assert power, to be adored. And that evolution marked a turning point. The world still saw a charming drifter with a good smile and a wild streak. But underneath, Glen had begun to believe that he deserved the attention he demanded, and that anyone who pulled away from him was taking something that belonged to him. People have a hard time recognizing danger when danger arrives smiling. In this phase of Glen Rogers' life, the storm inside him was silent enough to stay unnoticed and loud enough to shape every choice he made. He was stepping closer to the point of no return, and no one around him could see it. Not his friends, not his lovers, not the strangers who bought him drinks. The signs of escalation, of instability, of obsession were all there, but scattered so far across so many towns that no one could assemble the pattern. Not yet. Not until it was too late. Chapter 3. First cracks in the charm. From romance to vanishing acts. There comes a moment in every drifter's life where the patterns that once protected them begin to expose them instead, and for Glen Rogers, that turning point arrived quietly, without alarms or flashing signs, through relationships that began with charm and ended with confusion, fear, and disappearance. In his early 30s, his drifting lifestyle had become a ritual. Arrive in a new city, charm his way into someone's life, and stay just long enough for admiration to bloom and trust to form. But admiration alone had stopped being enough. He wanted devotion, control, total emotional submission. It wasn't that he feared losing people. He feared losing the version of himself they reflected back. When affection dimmed, when admiration slipped, when his place in someone's life felt threatened, his personality shifted from magnetic warmth to icy distance, a psychological winter that settled suddenly and without warning. Friends and lovers noticed this change before police ever did. A woman might tell her roommate she was head over heels for Glen one week and whisper anxiously that something felt off the next. A bartender might serve him drinks one night, and then one day realize the stool he always occupied had been empty for weeks. Nothing dramatic happened publicly, just a subtle pattern of people Glen grew close to suddenly leaving town or mysteriously cutting off contact with their social circles. At first, no one connected those dots because each story belonged to a different city, a different bar, a different circle of friends. Loved ones filed missing persons reports. Some assumed their daughters had run away. Others thought their friends were chasing new lives. But something about each case carried a quiet wrongness that only made sense later. Glen didn't need to force his way into lives anymore. People invited him in. A kind gesture here, a shared drink there, a story that felt intimate. Enough to create connection. He knew exactly how to make someone feel chosen. And because he could slip so easily into the life of whoever he was with, it was almost impossible to detect danger early on. He didn't storm into relationships with red flags waving. He entered like a dream and slowly turned into a storm. The moments when cracks first started showing were intensely subtle. A girlfriend might mention that Glen grew jealous when she talked to a friend. A cousin might recall overhearing Glen say he could read people too well. Others remembered him talking about leaving everything behind suddenly, not escaping trouble, but escaping responsibility. And when people pushed back, mildly, gently, with concern rather than accusation, he didn't explain or apologize. He vanished. He packed bags in the middle of the night, left apartments without returning keys, stopped answering calls from people who thought they mattered to him. Someone would fall in love with him, and then one day he was simply gone. In later investigations, that abrupt disappearing act became one of the most consistent behavioral markers in his early series of relationships. The first police departments to take notice didn't know they were dealing with the same man. A local detective in one southern city reviewed the file of a missing woman in her mid-20s whose new boyfriend had suddenly left town. In another state, a sheriff's office filed paperwork for an unidentified drifter who had been living with a woman just before she stopped answering messages from family. No one could attach a name to the boyfriend because Glen rarely used one name for long. He was Glen in one city, but a shortened nickname in another. Sometimes he used his middle name. Sometimes an invented last name that sounded common enough not to raise eyebrows. Driver's licenses were replaced, misplaced, or updated suspiciously often. Everything about him existed just long enough to be believed and disappeared just long enough to avoid investigation. What made his trail so invisible wasn't how careful he was. He wasn't careful at all. It was how ordinary he looked. Investigators in different jurisdictions described him as average-looking but attractive, friendly, outgoing, and the last man you'd expect to cause trouble. There were no fingerprints tying the early missing persons cases together, no crime scenes that pointed to a single technique or motive, and most importantly, there was no consistent name to search for. Rogers wasn't operating like a textbook predator. He was operating like a man who reinvented himself every time he felt uncomfortable, and that reinvention kept him ahead of suspicion. What outsiders didn't see was the psychological pressure building inside him. The drifting wasn't simply a choice, it was a compulsion. Glen had built his identity around looking like someone special, someone wanted, someone desirable. But the more validation he needed, the more volatile he became when validation wasn't enough. That emotional spiral grew faster with every new partner. He pursued closeness intensely, demanded loyalty fiercely, and interpreted any sign of independence as betrayal. Nights of affection could turn into days of silence without warning. A romantic dinner could become an argument over imagined slights. A moment of someone pulling away, even for space or self-care, could trigger the sense that he was being abandoned again. And when someone tried to leave him, emotionally or physically, he didn't negotiate or process that pain. He ran. The same night. The same hour. Leaving people staring at bedsheets that were still warm and jackets still hanging by the door. The abruptness of his departures became the only consistent thing about him. Some of the first warnings came not from family members of missing women, but from people who crossed Glen during his transitions between identities. A motel owner later reported that Glen left behind a drawer filled with women's belongings, jewelry, photos, clothes, but no identification linking any items to a specific city or missing persons case. A bartender in another city claimed that Glen left town just after a woman who'd been talking to him nightly stopped showing up. In yet another case, a coworker at a temporary job later told detectives that Glen had been obsessed with a woman who disappeared soon after they started seeing each other. But without evidence tying these stories together, detectives treated each case as isolated events. Glen relied on that gap, not intentionally, but instinctively. His entire life had been a lesson in how to run before consequences arrived. Even when suspicion swirled in small circles, Glen somehow remained above reproach. Parents of missing women who tried to ask him questions were met with selective memory. "She left first," or "We broke up," or "I don't know where she went after we stopped talking." The more emotional the parents became, the calmer Glen appeared, and calmness often reads as innocence to exhausted investigators. In a handful of situations, loved ones didn't even report their missing daughters to police right away because they assumed the women had followed Glen somewhere new. That was part of the tragedy. His charm didn't only make people trust him, it made them doubt their own instincts. By the midpoint of this period in Glen's life, a pattern of vanishing acts had formed across multiple states, but no one could see it from above. Every case lived in its own small jurisdiction, and only one person had the full picture: Glen himself. Whether he thought about the missing women, whether he justified his disappearances, whether he lost sleep over emotional chaos left behind, no one knows. What is clear is that something inside him shifted. His restlessness intensified. His drinking increased. His need for admiration turned almost ritualistic. People described him as charming before, but now they described him as unpredictable. One friend remembered him as exciting company, but not someone you'd rely on. A former partner called him a man who wanted love, but only if he could script the whole thing. These weren't dramatic comments, only subtle observations, the kind people make with hindsight. Law enforcement's first opportunity to truly connect Glen's wandering relationships to missing persons would come much later. But here, in the early chapters of his path toward infamy, he remained untouchable precisely because he seemed so harmless. And that was the most chilling reality of all. Danger doesn't always wear a scowl or stalk in darkness. Sometimes it arrives with a grin, offers you a seat, leans close, and makes you laugh. No alarms ring, no instincts activate, no guards go up until it's too late. Glen Rogers hadn't yet become a household name or a headline, but the emotional cracks that would lead to tragedy had already formed. Every city he left carried a missing face. Every romantic high ended in silence. Every disappearing act moved him one step closer to the version of himself the world would one day fear. Chapter 4. Cross-Country Shadows. The drifter no one could catch. By the time Glen Rogers slipped into the mid-1990s, his life had become a roadmap of cities strung together by instinct rather than direction. New Orleans, Memphis, Miami, Los Angeles, back through the Gulf Coast, then north again, never staying anywhere long enough for roots to form or consequences to catch up. He learned to move the same way a storm does, quietly at first, invisible in the distance, then suddenly there, appending everything before disappearing again. He wasn't hiding from the world. The world simply wasn't looking for him yet. To strangers he met in bars, gas stations, and roadside cafes, Glen was a handsome wanderer with stories of wild fortunes and glamorous connections, always delivered with the confidence of a man who expected admiration. He'd talk about owning a construction company in California, managing a nightclub in Florida, having wealthy friends who owed him favors, and because he told these stories with easy conviction, people believed him. But beneath the surface, none of it held still. His identity shifted depending on who was listening. If someone was wealthy, he claimed to be connected. If someone was lonely, he claimed to understand them. If someone needed protection, he became their protector. He mirrored people so well that they felt chosen, seen, almost understood, and that subtle pull became the reason he was welcomed into so many lives so quickly. But with every move, the stakes rose. The disappearances tied to his past relationships hadn't yet been linked to him in a way that triggered national alarm. But there was just enough suspicion swirling in smaller communities that Glen started behaving like a man outrunning whispers rather than policed. He'd skip town not only after a romantic relationship soured, but after any moment where someone looked at him a little too closely. A landlord asking for overdue rent, a bar owner asking for an ID, a neighbor asking questions about a woman who hadn't been seen lately. None of these were formal threats, but Glen treated curiosity like danger. Anywhere interest in him became too pointed, he vanished overnight, leaving nothing behind except the echo of conversations and a trail of questions no one had answers to. That constant running stripped away the casual wandering that once defined him and replaced it with a quieter hunger. He began seeking out relationships not for affection but for survival. He pursued people who could offer money, housing, admiration, or access to social circles that made him feel powerful. Every connection came with expectation. Every expectation carried tension. Every tension led eventually to a sudden disappearance that no one understood. Before long, Glen's trail began to overlap with law enforcement, not because anyone connected the missing persons cases yet, but because trouble seemed to bloom in places he passed through. In one city, a landlord told police that a tenant named Glen had left without paying rent. In another, a bartender reported that a man matching his description started fights over imagined insults. In yet another, a woman filed a complaint about a boyfriend who became overly possessive and then left town abruptly before she could break things off. These interactions weren't enough to make him a target. Nothing illegal enough, nothing concrete enough. But they created a faint constellation of instability across the country. No one traced the constellation yet, but if someone had looked at it from a great distance, they might have seen a shape forming. A man who needed admiration more than companionship, control more than love. But the truth stayed hidden because every story lived inside its own city limits, and Glen was always gone before anyone could compare notes. As time passed, Glen leaned more heavily on manipulation and performance to maintain his lifestyle. He developed routines that worked almost too well. He frequented bars and clubs where he knew the lighting, the music, and the drinks made people more trusting. He chose social environments where strangers bonded quickly, where someone could make a new best friend in a single evening, and no one asked too many questions. And he learned that the most effective way to gain someone's trust wasn't to ask for anything, but to give attention first. Compliments, shared secrets, the illusion of emotional intimacy. He gave these freely, not because he felt them, but because he knew how deeply others responded to them. Once someone believed he cared, he had access to their apartment, their car, their social circle, their sense of safety. The transformation was so seamless that many people didn't realize they'd let him into their lives until he was already inside their routines. Meanwhile, family members, ex-partners, and acquaintances from earlier chapters of his life were beginning to wonder why so many women who had crossed paths with Glen left so suddenly, and why none of them ever contacted home again. But suspicion alone can't solve a case. Some families assumed their daughters had started new lives. Others believed they were ashamed to return home after relationships fell apart. For police departments, every missing persons report was a story without evidence of foul play. No crime scenes, no witnesses, no clear suspects. Only women who seemingly disappeared on their own. Glen had become the perfect ghost suspect, not because he was careful, but because his victims vanished silently and his life looked too chaotic to track. Even when names finally reached detective desks, most were misspelled, misremembered, or matched aliases he no longer used. He wasn't invisible. He was forgettable, and forgettable is harder to catch than invisible. As Glen moved deeper into the American South, his behavior took on a more reckless edge. He stayed longer in some cities, charmed more aggressively, pursued attention more obsessively. The highs became higher. Nights of drinking, wild storytelling, the intoxicating feeling of being admired. But the lows also became more volatile. He disliked being challenged. He disliked independence in partners. He disliked any reminder that he wasn't the larger-than-life figure he claimed to be. And every time that illusion cracked, the urge to run returned stronger than before. Cities didn't just represent opportunities for connection anymore. They represented temporary stages, and when the audience failed to applaud the way he expected, he tore down the set and moved to the next location. It wasn't logic guiding him anymore. It was ego on a slow, spiraling descent. Around this time, conversations about Glen among former acquaintances began to shift from charm to danger. People who met him earlier described him as confident and fun. People who met him later described him as intense and unpredictable. A few used the word scary, though they couldn't explain why. Others admitted later that they ignored their instincts because they didn't want to misjudge someone charismatic. Some even said they felt sorry for him, a handsome drifter who seemed like he was running from some old hurt. These comments, coming years after the fact, reflected how effortlessly he manipulated empathy. Glen didn't need people to fear him. He needed them to forgive him, excuse him, or underestimate him. Fear would come later. For now, invisibility was still his greatest advantage. What no one realized was that Glen was edging toward a tipping point. The distance between who he pretended to be and who he really was had become too wide to sustain. The relationships he formed no longer soothed him. The admiration he chased no longer satisfied him. The running that once made him feel untouchable now made him feel hunted, even in cities where no one knew his name. He began drinking more heavily and isolating more quickly. He stopped returning calls from people who genuinely cared. He said less, trusted less, and demanded more loyalty from others even as he offered less of himself in return. The emotional turbulence that once simmered inside him had begun to spill outward, not yet in the way that would make him infamous, but enough that strangers remembered him as the guy who wasn't quite right. And yet, he continued drifting across state lines with ease. Police still didn't connect him to missing women, friends still didn't compare stories, and the cities that welcomed him still didn't realize they were welcoming a storm. Glen had reached a point of no return, but he didn't know it yet. From the outside, He was still the charming drifter who bought the next round of drinks and made people laugh. But from the inside, something had changed. The admiration he sought no longer filled the void. It only made it deeper. He always believed he'd get away with everything because no one ever stopped him. And without realizing it, that belief became the beginning of his downfall. The quiet arrogance that transformed a fugitive of emotional chaos into a man who would soon become the center of one of America's most sensational manhunts. Chapter 5. The Vanishing Trail, Loved Ones Searching for Answers. The pattern of disappearances connected to Glen Rogers began quietly, almost invisibly, because none of the women who went missing vanished in the same place, or under the same circumstances, or into the same silence. Yet each case carried the same haunting detail. The last person known to see them was a charming stranger who drifted into their lives just long enough to win trust, then disappeared himself. Families and friends noticed first. Of course, a daughter who never called home after promising she would, a sister who missed a birthday tradition for the first time in her life, a coworker who simply stopped showing up without collecting her final paycheck. At first, the reactions were confusion rather than fear. People assumed these women had simply moved on, started a new life, escaped a situation they didn't want to explain. But as days stretched into weeks, and weeks stretched into months, the tone slowly shifted from concern to dread. Loved ones began reaching out to neighbors, landlords, and acquaintances, asking whether anyone had seen them. Again and again, a vaguely similar story surfaced. A new man in their lives, someone confident, someone smooth, someone described as almost too charming, a man who claimed to be a contractor, an artist, a businessman, depending on who asked, but who always dressed well, spoke well, and disappeared as soon as questions became too precise. His name differed each time. Glenn, Glenna's boyfriend, the guy from Kentucky, or simply that new guy she was seeing. And the variations alone made it impossible to connect the dots, because the women disappeared in different states, under police departments that rarely communicated, in communities that had nothing else in common except the shadow of a stranger who knew how to leave without being remembered. It wasn't law enforcement who first noticed the pattern. It was families, mothers calling police stations hundreds of miles away from where their daughters were last seen. Fathers insisting that their child would never walk away without saying goodbye. Siblings collecting scraps of information from acquaintances and structuring them into timelines that felt impossible to prove because there were no crime scenes, no witness reports, no confirmed evidence of wrongdoing. Police departments could only respond with policy. Adults are allowed to disappear. Missing doesn't necessarily mean endangered. Without signs of a struggle or clear evidence of a crime, the cases were filed away, not ignored, but suspended in a kind of limbo that investigators were powerless to resolve. This kept Glenn one step ahead not because he was brilliant, but because he was forgettable. He attached himself to women whose social circles were small, whose jobs required night shifts or travel, whose family lived in other states and didn't know their day-to-day routines. When they vanished, there was no immediate circle that could connect the timeline quickly enough to raise alarm. The few people who did notice Glenn's presence could describe him in rich detail. His charm, his smiles, the way he made someone feel special, but they couldn't provide a photo, a social security number, a license plate, or even a legal full name. The relationships happened fast, burned brightly for a moment, then faded into dust before anyone had time to understand what was happening. Behind the scenes, Glenn began to display subtle but dangerous shifts in behavior that, in hindsight, formed a portrait of a man unraveling from the inside. Where he once relied on slow trust building and emotional manipulation, he now pushed for faster access, moving into homes, borrowing money, asking for help before affection had time to deepen naturally. He didn't want connection anymore. He wanted control. And he didn't want admiration. He wanted dependence. Partners who once felt chosen now felt pressured. More than one woman confided in a friend that the relationship had gone from thrilling to unsettling almost overnight. That Glenn had become possessive, impatient, unpredictable. But conversations like these weren't documented. They lived in small confessions over coffee, late-night calls, journal entries never read by anyone until later. People sensed danger, but they couldn't define it. They felt the shift, but they didn't understand its consequences. Fear without evidence is easy to dismiss, especially when the person causing the fear is handsome, attentive, and charismatic enough to explain away every red flag. Meanwhile, certain detectives across different states began sensing something was wrong, but could not prove it. A Louisiana investigator reviewing a missing persons file noticed that the boyfriend's name was inconsistent depending on who was interviewed. A Mississippi detective recalled a woman who went missing the same week a stranger matching Glen's appearance abruptly left town. In Florida, a bartender told a patrol officer that she was worried about a customer because her new boyfriend seemed too intense, and then the customer never returned to the bar again. None of these details found their way into the same folder. None were entered into the same database. Each sat inside their own local jurisdiction, quietly waiting for someone to ask the right question. At the time, no one did. Information was scattered across 3 time zones, handwritten on forms that no one outside the department ever saw. One investigator even marked a case as possible domestic dispute, low priority, not because of negligence, but because he had nothing concrete to work with. Without a crime scene or a suspect, police departments were left holding puzzle pieces without knowing there was a puzzle at all. As the months passed, the emotional toll on families deepened. Some parents posted flyers across cities even though they knew their daughters might never see them. Others called hospitals repeatedly on the slim chance that the person they loved had been admitted under a different name. Some tried tracking bank activity, and when withdrawals stopped, they were relieved at first, believing their daughters had simply run out of money. Only later did they realize that no financial activity was worse than anything else. It meant the trail was cold. Friends blamed themselves, replaying the last conversation they had, wondering whether they should have said something sooner, done something sooner, worried sooner. Many felt guilty for doubting their instincts when something felt off, but not enough to justify action. The hardest part was not finding the missing. It was trying to convince the world that these disappearances were linked, that someone was out there preying on women who trusted too easily, loved too quickly, or simply believed that kindness in a stranger meant safety. Eventually, state lines did what Glen never expected. They betrayed him. When someone runs far enough, for long enough, patterns form even without intention. 2 missing persons reports in neighboring states contain nearly identical descriptions of a man who entered a woman's life suddenly and vanished just as suddenly after she disappeared. A detective in Florida overheard a conversation between colleagues about a similar case in Mississippi and requested a file out of curiosity. A young investigator, fresh out of academy training and not yet conditioned to dismiss intuition in favor of statistics, noticed that the same physical description kept appearing in cases involving women who had recently entered whirlwind romances with mysterious strangers. These weren't formal breakthroughs, but they were the first threads connecting Glen to something larger than the isolated rumors and concerns he left behind in every city. Still, the nation wouldn't know his name for months. The public had no idea that a storm was crossing the country because the storm looked like a man who flirted, smiled, and bought drinks for strangers. But inside law enforcement circles, in hushed conversations behind closed doors, a phrase began appearing in internal memos: possible serial targeting pattern. The term was cautious, clinical, and speculative, but it was the first step toward recognizing that the disappearances weren't random at all. And as soon as the possibility was acknowledged, Glen's world, which had once felt limitless, began shrinking quietly and without warning. He didn't feel the walls closing in yet. To him, nothing had changed. He still believed he was smarter than everyone else, still believed he could walk into any city and become anyone he wanted to be. The idea of consequences seemed distant, almost unreal, because up to that moment, consequences had never arrived. He didn't know that somewhere, detectives were gathering notes, that somewhere, families were finding each other online and comparing timelines, that somewhere, Police departments were beginning to wonder whether a stranger had been living in their city long enough to charm someone, and long enough to make them disappear. For the first time, even though Glen couldn't see it, the story of his freedom and the story of his downfall had begun to merge. Chapter 6: Whispers of a Predator. The first links between cities. As the months passed, Glen Rogers continued drifting from city to city with the same polished confidence that had always shielded him. But something subtle had changed in the way the world responded to his presence. Instead of slipping into new communities unnoticed, he began slipping into communities already touched by fear, places where loved ones quietly traded rumors about women who had moved away unexpectedly, phone calls that stopped too soon, and families who were desperately waiting for answers that no one had. People didn't yet know about each other, didn't know that their stories were connected across state lines, but the unease was beginning to take shape like a storm cloud forming long before rain falls. In one city, a landlord mentioned to police that a tenant had left suddenly just after a new boyfriend arrived. In another, a bartender remembered a handsome stranger who charmed half the room while fixating almost obsessively on a woman he left with. In another, a group of co-workers spoke in hushed tones about a colleague who vanished the same week she brought a new man to an after-work gathering. None of these observations were dramatic enough to trigger alarms on their own, but when viewed from afar, they resembled puzzle pieces waiting for the picture to be recognized. Even so, time worked in Glen's favor. He never stayed long enough for questions to accumulate, never long enough for stories to breathe. Before suspicion could boil into certainty, he was already gone, a ghost leaving behind a faint scent of blame, confusion, and a name no one could quite confirm. The earliest hints of a connection came not from detectives at first, but from families who refused to stop searching. Internet forums were still new in the 1990s, but they became an unexpected lifeline, a place where people exchanged missing persons flyers that didn't appear on bulletin boards, swapped timelines police weren't tracking, and compared descriptions of the men their loved ones had recently trusted. Again and again, a similar figure emerged, tall, handsome, southern accent, blue eyes, sandy-colored hair, and a way of speaking that made people feel like they mattered. Then there were the mannerisms, the confidence, the way he leaned in when he talked, the habit of talking about himself in stories that sounded bigger than life. Someone in Mississippi posted that her sister had disappeared after dating a man who claimed to own a construction business in California. A mother in Florida replied that her daughter had also dated someone who claimed to run a business in California. The women didn't know each other, but they recognized the tone of worry in each other's messages. Something was happening, but neither had enough proof to convince police that their concerns were linked. For law enforcement in the 90s, every disappearance without evidence of foul play remained a local case, confined to the jurisdiction where it was reported. That system made sense at the time, but it also gave someone like Glen Rogers a level of freedom he could never have achieved in a world with instant digital records. Meanwhile, Glen refined his ability to manipulate not by changing who he was, but by sharpening who he appeared to be. He paid close attention to what each woman needed emotionally: companionship, validation, support, escape, and shaped himself to provide exactly that. If someone felt lonely, he appeared attentive. If someone felt insecure, he showered them with admiration. If someone had been mistreated, he became fiercely protective. It wasn't affection that drove him. It was strategy, a way of securing access, comfort, and control while ensuring no one questioned his presence. But there was an unmistakable shift in his personality. The patience he once relied on began to erode. He didn't want to spend weeks winning trust anymore. He wanted immediate devotion, instant access, unquestioning loyalty. People close to him sensed the change even if they didn't understand it. They described him as clingy, intense, easily offended, and increasingly jealous of attention that wasn't directed at him. In conversations, the line between charm and hostility narrowed. The same smile that once put people at ease now carried an undercurrent of expectation. He needed to be admired, and any hint of independence from a partner triggered resentment he could barely conceal. Those emotional cracks began to leave literal traces that caught investigators' attention. A detective in Louisiana came across a missing persons case file from Mississippi while consulting on a completely different matter and was struck by the similarities between the two women involved, both described as recently in new relationships, both last seen withdrawing cash in the company of a man, both families concerned by vague details about a boyfriend whose background couldn't be confirmed. At first, the detective shrugged it off. Coincidence wasn't evidence, but something about it bothered him enough to request additional files. When he received them, he noticed a pattern. In several disappearances across the South, the women's final days had been spent with a man who claimed to be from California but could never give a precise location when asked. That detail lingered in the back of the detective's mind, but he lacked the authority to open multi-state investigations. Even so, he quietly entered an internal note into a regional network, flagging that a possible wandering predator might be involved in several missing persons cases. The note didn't generate immediate action, but it meant that, for the first time, Glen's name was hovering somewhere within law enforcement's orbit. The emotional consequences of his path were growing heavier on the people he left behind. Not only the families of the missing, but individuals Glen briefly befriended during his stays in different cities. A man in Memphis remembered him as someone who smiled easily, but never shared anything real about himself. A co-worker from a temporary construction job said he got the feeling that Glen was constantly acting, constantly trying to make people think he was impressive. A neighbor recalled that he never brought mail to the house, never took phone calls in front of anyone, and always seemed ready to leave at a moment's notice. People who crossed paths with Glen couldn't agree on who he was, but they all agreed on one thing. There was something deeply hidden beneath the surface, something that made them uneasy without knowing why. And unease doesn't get reported to the police. Unease stays in people's memories, not in case files. Only when investigators interviewed these individuals much later, long after Glen had become infamous, did they realize that dozens of people had sensed danger without being able to define it. Then there were the women who survived encounters with Glen, not because they escaped violence, but because something inside him decided not to pursue control in that moment. One woman later recalled that she cut ties after Glen told her a story that didn't add up. She felt guilty for ending things abruptly, until she saw his name years later on the news. Another said she broke things off because he had a scary temper when drinking. A third said she didn't understand why her instincts told her to run, only that the feeling was strong enough to propel her out of the city in the middle of the night. These women didn't know each other, but their stories overlapped in eerily consistent ways. Glen noticed isolation in others and used it. He inserted himself quickly into their lives. He became possessive fast, and when they started pulling away, he reacted unpredictably. Their accounts formed a psychological map of Glen that law enforcement would later rely on heavily, long after the public learned his name. Meanwhile, the slow shift in police awareness was beginning to take shape. Investigators from 3 states attended a regional conference and stumbled upon an informal conversation about transient partners connected to missing women. A conversation that prompted someone to request old files from other departments. Even then, no one used the word serial killer, not because the threat wasn't real, but because law enforcement in the mid-90s remained cautious about applying the label without proof. Still, suspicion was enough to begin comparing case notes. Names, aliases, timelines, states, relationships, pieces that once sat separate began to move toward one another. Finally, a name surfaced that matched more than one case: Glen. In one department's records, he was listed as a boyfriend. In another, he was a roommate. In another, a man seen leaving a bar with a missing woman. It wasn't enough to issue a warrant, but it was enough to build curiosity. Curiosity is quiet at first, but it's powerful. Detectives began calling other departments, asking for copies of missing persons reports. They called families, requesting photos and information about the mysterious boyfriend. They traced phone numbers only to find they didn't exist. They tried to locate addresses that led to abandoned buildings or apartments suddenly vacated. Every lead became another thread, and every thread led to Glen, a man who wasn't running from police yet, because he didn't know they were coming. At this point in time, Glen still believed he was invisible. He didn't realize the world was learning to speak his name. And just as investigators began piecing together the pattern, Glen did what he always did when pressure closed in. Even pressure he didn't consciously recognize. He ran again. New city, new relationships, new stories. He didn't leave because he sensed law enforcement getting close. He left because his internal storm was intensifying. The more unstable he became emotionally, the more rapidly he moved. Wherever he stayed, he left unease. Wherever he went, fear followed. Not yet the loud fear of headlines. Not yet the public terror that comes when a killer has a name. But the quiet fear of unanswered questions, missing daughters, and strangers who arrived suddenly and disappeared even faster. The moment was approaching when all of these whispers, from families, acquaintances, police officers, and survivors, would collide. But Glen didn't know it. To him, he was still untouchable, still clever, still charming enough to talk his way into the lives of strangers and just as easily talk his way out. He didn't realize that somewhere, across the map he once used as a playground, detectives were starting to draw lines, and those lines were all pointing toward the same man. Chapter 7. The Summer of Silence. A city begins to tremble. The summer heat across the Gulf states should have brought light, laughter, and tourists, but instead it came with a strange heaviness. Not loud, not dramatic, but a quiet, persistent sense that something was wrong, even if no one could yet put words to it. Women weren't vanishing all at once. They disappeared like flickering lights, one city at a time, one town at a time, one family at a time. The only people connecting the dots were those suffering through the same unanswered questions. Mothers staring at telephones, siblings retracing social media posts, friends replaying their last conversations with someone who promised to call back and never did. Meanwhile, Glen Rogers walked through these cities with the same polished confidence he always carried. But his internal world was shifting. He was drinking more heavily, forming bonds more quickly, ending them more abruptly, and chasing admiration with a desperation that suggested even he no longer knew what he was running from. To strangers, he still looked like the charming drifter with a magnetic smile. But to the people who met him near the end of his stays, the illusion was cracking. A waitress in Mississippi recalled that he seemed anxious when she asked ordinary questions. A neighbor in Florida noticed that he paced the yard at night, smoking aggressively down to the filter. A bartender in Louisiana remembered that he got angry when she didn't laugh at one of his jokes. Anger that vanished as fast as it appeared, replaced by an apology that sounded too smooth to feel genuine. It was as if Glen had reached a point where he could no longer maintain the version of himself he portrayed to the world without slipping. Detectives in several states were beginning to notice something unusual as well. Not evidence, not proof, but a rhythm. Women who had recently turned up missing were last seen in the company of someone who didn't seem to exist on paper. No ID that could be verified, no driver's license that matched a name, no record of addresses beyond temporary rentals, short-term motels, or borrowed couches. They weren't tracking a criminal with a history. They were tracking an idea of a man. Files began to move, not because the system was built for interstate collaboration, but because individual investigators refused to let their cases fade into cold archives. One Florida detective called a fellow investigator in Louisiana to ask whether they'd ever encountered a suspect who introduced himself by one name to friends and another name to employers. That same detective reached out to an investigator in Kentucky to ask whether any of their missing persons had been reported after lightning-fast romantic relationships. These calls didn't lead to warrants or arrests, but they built momentum. Momentum that kept Glen from slipping fully into the anonymity he believed protected him. Meanwhile, the communities affected by the disappearances had no idea their grief was shared. Flyers appeared in convenience stores, laundromats, and diners. Different faces, different names, different dates. But strangers rushed past them without realizing they were staring at variations of the same tragedy. What made the situation even more haunting was that the victims were not people who lived reckless lives. Not people looking for trouble. Not people who ignored danger. They were simply people who trusted a man who seemed trustworthy. The danger was not that Glen looked threatening, but that he didn't. And that invisibility was his greatest weapon. Women brought him home because he made them feel seen. Friends welcomed him into social circles because he made them laugh. Communities let him blend in because nothing about him suggested danger from a distance. The hardest truth for investigators, and later for the families, was that Glen didn't gain access to victims through force. He gained access through charm. And charm does not look like crime until it is too late. By late summer, multiple jurisdictions finally compared case notes and recognized that they were not dealing with isolated disappearances. They were dealing with a pattern. It still wasn't enough to identify a suspect, but it was enough to circulate an internal alert. Women across multiple states had gone missing after brief relationships with a tall, charismatic drifter with blue eyes and sandy hair. And even though they didn't have a name yet, the description was precise enough to make a difference. Patrol officers began asking more questions when they encountered men who matched the profile. Bartenders and motel clerks started remembering the women who left with strangers just a little more vividly. Glen didn't know it, but the margins of his freedom were narrowing. Not because he was being actively hunted yet, but because the world was learning to see through his disguise. And as the days turned colder, the public mood in several cities shifted from confusion to quiet fear. People weren't talking about a serial predator. That term hadn't reached the headlines yet, but they were talking about missing girls. They were talking about relationships that seemed too intense too quickly. They were warning each other about bringing strangers home. One bar hung a handwritten sign that read, "If a man gives you a bad feeling, trust it, we'll call you a cab." That wasn't awareness of Glen, it was awareness of danger in human form. Women were becoming more cautious. Friends were walking to their cars in groups. Men were watching their sisters and partners and co-workers more carefully. Instinct, not information, was spreading protection. But Glen, unaware that suspicion was beginning to grow in communities he had once drifted through unnoticed, kept moving as if nothing had changed. In his mind, he was still untouchable. He still believed he could talk his way into any life and talk his way out again. He didn't know that in several police departments across the Gulf states, investigators now kept a separate drawer in their offices, a drawer with the names and faces of missing women, and that drawer contained a thread tying them all together, a man no one could correctly name, but everyone was beginning to describe. The next step, the turning point that shifted this story from rumor to full manhunt, was closer than Glen realized. All it would take was one mistake, one witness who paid attention, one department that connected information quickly enough to act. And somewhere in the background, under the weight of unanswered questions and unknown dangers, that moment was already beginning to form. Chapter 8. The first name, the first face. A killer steps into the spotlight. The shift from private fear to public alarm happened slowly at first, like a low hum building beneath the noise of everyday life. And then all at once, when the disappearances that had been whispered in kitchens, posted on flyers, and prayed over in sleepless bedrooms finally crossed paths with the media. It started with a single regional news segment. A reporter covering a missing woman in Mississippi who had last been seen with a new boyfriend named Glen, a man who had told neighbors he was working in construction and planning a move to Florida. The broadcast didn't mention other missing women in other states, because those connections hadn't yet reached the newsroom. But someone watching, a woman in Louisiana, whose sister had gone missing months earlier, froze when she heard the segment. Her sister's boyfriend had also been named Glen. He claimed to be from California. He disappeared the same week her sister did. The next morning, she called the news station. Then she called the police. That single call became the spark that began drawing lines no one had seen before. Local reporters, driven more by instinct than evidence, began comparing details between missing persons cases. Within days, a pattern emerged that the public wasn't prepared for. Different women, different cities, different dates. But in more than one story, a man named Glen appeared just before the disappearance. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to turn quiet anxiety into something louder. Police departments that had once treated these cases as isolated incidents now found themselves forwarding files across state lines, comparing timelines, and re-interviewing people who had known the missing women. Friends who had once felt ignored or dismissed were now asked to recount every detail they could remember. First impressions, last conversations, arguments, gifts, phone calls, anything that might help. And time after time, the same description surfaced. Tall, handsome, a smooth talker, blue eyes, sandy blonde hair, southern accent, confident, charismatic, sometimes drinking too much, quick to anger when challenged. For the first time, investigators now had enough overlapping information to build a composite sketch, not a drawing yet, but a psychological profile, a pattern of behaviors that fit like a blueprint. A man who inserted himself rapidly into romantic relationships, demanded attention, flattered intensely, discouraged independence, and vanished as soon as someone questioned him. A detective in Florida finally said aloud what others had only begun to consider. "We're looking at the same man." And with that statement, everything changed. Reporters, never far from the scent of fear, picked up the pattern with a speed that surprised even detectives. Newspaper headlines began naming the unknown suspect as a charming drifter. And although the language was sensationalized for readership, it contained an unnerving truth. His danger came from the way he didn't seem dangerous. The media gave the public a face to watch for, a type to distrust, and suddenly men who matched that description in bars and parking lots found themselves under scrutiny, even if they had never heard of Glen Rogers. Women shared warnings through phone calls and early online forums, telling one another that if a stranger approached with too much charm, too fast, it was safer to walk away. College campuses circulated flyers urging students not to leave bars with unfamiliar men. Some cities even hosted informal self-defense meetups as fear spread quietly between communities. Yet still, no one had a confirmed full name. Glen existed more as a dark outline than a real person. Not quite visible, not quite invisible. A presence that felt almost mythological in how easily he moved through the world. The breakthrough came not from detectives or journalists, but from coincidence. A motel worker in Florida called police after seeing a news segment about a missing woman from Mississippi because the boyfriend mentioned in the segment matched a guest who had stayed at the motel weeks earlier, a guest who skipped out on the bill, leaving behind a copy of a driver's license that, when examined, turned out to be fake. But the signature wasn't. Glen Rogers. It was the first time any tangible document tied a real identity to the mysterious drifter. When the name was entered into multiple databases, it produced a hit, not for a serious crime, but for a minor arrest in California years earlier. The booking photo attached to that record became the first confirmed image of the man being sought across multiple states. For the first time, investigators could look into the eyes of the stranger who had slipped through their jurisdictions like smoke. It wasn't a mugshot that screamed danger. It was a picture of a man who looked ordinary, confident, even relaxed. But that was what made it so chilling. They finally had a face, but the face looked like someone who could walk into any bar in America and be welcomed without hesitation. When the photo reached the media, everything shifted. For the families of missing women, it was devastating, not because they had proof of what happened to their daughters and sisters, but because the man they had trusted was no longer just a ghost. He was real, and he had a name, and the search for answers now had a target. For the public, fear took on a sharper edge. Women who had once dismissed their instincts now wondered if they had ever sat near him without realizing it. Men who resembled him found themselves questioned by strangers in parking lots and grocery stores. Bars and clubs reported individuals leaving abruptly rather than risk being suspected. And yet, through all of this chaos, Glen remained unaware that his anonymity was collapsing. He still walked into crowded spaces with the air of a man who believed he could talk his way out of anything. He still watched people with the evaluating eyes of someone deciding who was vulnerable to admiration and who wasn't worth the trouble. The world knew his face now, but he didn't know the world had changed. Detectives scrambled to locate him before the public did. The fear wasn't only that he would hurt someone else. The fear was that a citizen might try to confront him first. and that could spiral into tragedy. For the first time, interstate coordination took control of the investigation. Phone trees lit up between departments. Maps were marked with pins. Witness reports were logged into multi-agency systems, and a task force began assembling to track Glen's last known locations. But finding him was like chasing a shadow. Every time a tip came in, sightings in Louisiana, Tennessee, Ohio, police would arrive to discover that they were always a day or two behind. He was driving long distances, staying in cheap motels, working odd jobs under false names, then abandoning everything before anyone could question him. The faster investigators moved, the faster Glen moved, as if he had a sixth sense for the moment attention drew too close. He didn't know yet that he was wanted, but he could feel something closing in. An instinct told him to run. The public, however, reacted differently. Once the photo was released, people across the South and Midwest began calling hotlines, convinced they had seen Glen weeks earlier at a gas station, a convenience store, a roadside diner. Some of the tips were false memories fueled by fear, but a handful were real, and those few created a loose trail that investigators followed relentlessly. The most haunting part was that in almost every confirmed sighting, Glen had not been hiding. He had been smiling, flirting, joking, or drinking, acting like a man who believed the world adored him. He was fearless, not because he was brave, but because he thought he was invisible. When the task force reviewed those reports, one thing became clear. If Glen realized he was being hunted, the danger, to himself and others, would escalate dramatically. The mission was not only to find him, but to do it before he understood that anyone was looking. And though Glen remained unaware of his growing infamy, the world around him was beginning to change in small ways he couldn't quite explain. Bartenders who once laughed at his jokes now watched him warily from a distance. Motel managers were less eager to hand over keys without seeing ID. Women were slower to trust attention from strangers, even strangers who smiled warmly. Glen didn't know it, but the illusion he relied on, the illusion of harmlessness, was fading. The public didn't know who he was before, but now that they did, the world had begun learning to see him for what he was, a man who used charm as a mask. And when the mask begins to slip, even slightly, the danger becomes easier to recognize. The hunt was no longer a whisper. It was beginning. Chapter 9, The Net Titans, a manhunt across America. The transformation of the Glen Rogers case from scattered missing person files into a coordinated, multi-state pursuit marked the beginning of one of the most tense law enforcement races of the decade, and it changed the atmosphere of the American South in ways that were both visible and invisible. On the surface, life continued. Highways thrummed with truck engines, diners filled with regulars passing time over coffee, and neon signs buzzed to life in small cities after sunset. But beneath all of that everyday motion, the presence of a man on the run rippled across communities. It wasn't just fear of a killer. It was the unsettling knowledge that he could be anywhere, talking to anyone, smiling in someone's doorway. When investigators released his name publicly, they expected him to stop, to hide, but they misunderstood the man they were chasing. Instead of laying low, Glen became more frenetic. There was a restlessness visible in the crumbs of his trail: abandoned motel rooms, impulsive relocations, rushed goodbyes to strangers he had charmed only days earlier. The movement wasn't random. It was impulsive, emotional, almost defensive, as if every mile driven was an attempt to outrun a truth he couldn't bear to face. Tips came in waves. Some were dead ends, some were mistaken sightings, and some were chillingly accurate, but always just late enough that officers arrived to find nothing but memories and cigarette smoke lingering. Behind him, in Louisiana, a bartender remembered him bragging loudly about big things coming. In Alabama, a waitress recalled how he had bought drinks for strangers with cash that somehow never seemed to run out. In Texas, a mechanic reported that Glen spent hours painting a car in a rented shed before vanishing without paying. These stories didn't just form a map. They formed a picture of a man who was oscillating wildly between confidence and panic, between charm and volatility, between believing he was untouchable and fearing he was already defeated. Detectives studying the timeline noticed a theme. The more the pressure increased, the more Glen sought validation, compliments, admiration, attention, as though approval itself was fuel. But approval was harder to find now. The world was learning his face. People were learning to be cautious with men who moved too fast. As the manhunt intensified, so did the internal conversations within law enforcement. Different states had different theories about what motivated Glen. Was he acting out of revenge, abandonment, desperation, thrill, ego, or something that didn't fit any established pattern? Criminal psychologists were brought in, and their consensus was unsettling in its simplicity. Glen didn't seek power in the traditional predatory sense. He sought significance. His crimes were not rooted solely in violence, but in the need to feel important, to feel extraordinary to someone, even if only briefly. That kind of personality, they warned, becomes more unpredictable when cornered. If Glen sensed life closing in on him, he would not surrender quietly. He would try to prove something, to himself, to the world, to a fantasy of who he believed he should have been. The chase was no longer just about catching him. It was about preventing what cornered ego might ignite. Meanwhile, newspapers and television networks leaned into the story, each trying to outdo the other in dramatic headlines. They branded him with nicknames he never asked for, ones crafted to boost ratings and sell papers. And as those names spread, the pressure mounted not just on investigators, but on the communities that suddenly felt they were under threat. In bars and diners, conversations pivoted from sports and weather to speculation about this smooth-talking drifter. Women who lived alone started checking their locks twice before bed. Men who traveled for work spent their evenings on the phone with worried partners. Every hitchhiker, every stranger with a southern accent, every man who introduced himself too eagerly became a potential suspect in the public imagination. And while some of that fear was misplaced, some of it wasn't. There were confirmed sightings, chilling in their timing, where Glen had already left town by the time the first flyer was posted. Eventually, the case shifted from a reactive pursuit to a proactive trap. Investigators stopped waiting for tips and started predicting Glen's movements. They studied his spending habits, the kinds of bars he favored, the hours he preferred to travel, the states he gravitated toward, and the emotional triggers that consistently preceded a relocation. A geographical profiler suggested that Glen would eventually return to places where he felt powerful, cities where he had been admired, where he had spent money freely, or where he had been treated as someone special. That theory reshaped the hunt. Rather than scattering resources across the map, detectives concentrated attention on specific regions where Glen had once felt recognized. Surveillance increased quietly. Highway patrol was briefed without alerting local news. Officers were told to watch motels near highways, check bars that drew drifters, and scan parking lots for abandoned or recently repainted vehicles. It was the largest coordinated effort the case had seen, and it was built not on brute force, but on understanding the man they were chasing. Yet in the midst of all this tightening scrutiny, Glen remained unaware that the noose was drawing closer. In his mind, the occasional suspicious glance from a bartender or motel manager was nothing more than paranoia. The changing tone of strangers, cautious rather than impressed, barely registered. Inside the illusion he had lived in for most of his life, he remained the star of his own story. And that illusion made him careless. In a small town outside Jacksonville, Florida, he struck up a conversation with a woman who worked at a convenience store, a woman who, by chance, had watched a news segment about him that morning. She recognized his face instantly, but instead of reacting, she smiled politely, working to keep her hands steady as she rang up his purchases. She forced small talk, memorized every detail she could, his car, his license plate, the direction he left in, and as soon as he drove away, she dialed 911. The dispatcher immediately placed the call at the highest priority level. Within minutes, patrol cars were moving. But even then, the case didn't snap shut. Detectives arrived to find that Glen had already taken a wrong turn into the maze of rural roads, slipping back into the vastness of America's highway system. Still, the moment was pivotal not because he was caught, but because for the first time, investigators were close enough to chase. They now had his car make, model, and plate number. They had a real-time direction of travel. The chase was no longer based on memories, it was based on miles. State troopers in multiple jurisdictions set up quiet perimeter zones. Toll booth workers were given his photo. Parking attendants were briefed. And all of it was coordinated below the radar of the media to prevent tipping him off. But Glen wasn't running because of law enforcement. He was running because his world, the illusion that had protected him for years, was beginning to feel unstable. For the first time, admiration from strangers wasn't guaranteed. His jokes didn't land the same way. The validation that fueled him was evaporating. And without admiration, there was only the void, the one he had spent his entire life trying to outrun. The manhunt that followed wouldn't be fast, and it wouldn't be clean. It would stretch across state lines, across long nights and early mornings, across moments where officers were seconds too late or half a mile too far. But from that point forward, the dynamic was irreversible. For months, Glen had been chasing admiration. Now the world was chasing him. He was still in motion, still charming, still unpredictable. But the illusion that had once made him invisible had begun to die. And when a man who defines himself through attention realizes that the world no longer applauds, only watches, the most dangerous phase begins. Chapter 10: The Fall of the Mask. When America learned his name. The shift from whispers to headlines did not happen all at once. It began with scattered news reports, missing persons notices, and vague police statements that hinted at danger without naming it. Then one night, without warning, millions of Americans sitting in their living rooms heard a name spoken over the evening news: Glen Rogers, and the world suddenly had a face to attach to the fear. Cameras panned across mugshots and grainy surveillance stills, anchors describing him as charismatic, unpredictable, and highly mobile. The kind of man who could strike up a conversation with anyone and leave them feeling like they had known him forever. The moment his identity became public, everything changed. Certain bartenders froze when they recognized the picture. Certain towns fell silent, and countless people realized that the charming stranger who bought them a drink, fixed their flat tire, or flirted with them at a party might not have been a harmless drifter at all. Even for those who didn't know him personally, the sudden media explosion created a collective realization: danger didn't always look dangerous. Evil didn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes it sat on a barstool laughing with strangers. Investigators moved quickly. Now that the public knew the name, sightings multiplied: gas stations, motels, diners, roadside stores. Some leads were hours old, some minutes, but every report deepened the understanding of how Glen lived. He moved constantly, but not randomly. He watched people, tested boundaries, and inserted himself into places where his confidence could attract attention and opportunity. He always looked like he belonged, even when he didn't. And though his ability to charm strangers had once been a protective shield, now it became a liability. The more people recognized him, the faster word spread. Detectives studied each tip with increasing intensity, mapping his locations, tracing receipts, analyzing behavioral patterns, and quietly coordinating with multiple states. For the first time, Glen was behind in the game. He didn't know who to trust, which towns knew his face, or how quickly the net was closing around him. But the most dangerous part of the manhunt wasn't the public panic or the news coverage. It was Glen himself unraveling. As the pressure mounted, he grew reckless. He stayed too long in places he should have passed through. He confided in people he barely knew. His need for validation, the praise, the admiration, the ego-feeding attention, increased as the world turned against him. That internal conflict left a trail of chaos behind him, not through physical details, but through emotion. Sudden anger where charm used to be, jealousy where confidence used to be, desperation where swagger used to be. Detectives recognized the shift and knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for. When a man like Glen begins to lose control of his image, he becomes sloppy, not because he wants to be caught, but because he refuses to accept that the performance is over. What ultimately transformed the Glen Rogers case from a high-stakes chase into a coordinated national effort was not a single breakthrough, but the accumulation of tiny moments, gas station receipts, fragments of overheard conversations, credit card swipes in the wrong state at the wrong time, scraps of handwriting on motel registration cards, and strangers across the country remembering one detail at the exact right moment. Each piece on its own meant nothing, but together they formed a pattern that investigators could follow with increasing precision. Glen didn't realize how many people were talking to police. He didn't realize how many motel clerks were comparing his smiles to the photograph taped under their countertops. And most importantly, he didn't realize how many everyday workers, waitresses, cab drivers, bartenders, were paying attention long after he assumed they'd forgotten him. Every person who remembered him clearly enough to describe his mannerisms added to the file that shaped the pursuit. As news spread, a strange duality emerged across the communities he moved through. Some people responded with fear and avoidance. Others responded with adrenaline and curiosity. There were small towns where every stranger suddenly became suspicious, and there were bars where patrons whispered about whether the infamous drifter might walk in. But in all those places, the psychological weight of his presence, whether real or imagined, pushed police to tighten their coordination. The FBI became more deeply involved, analyzing patterns of travel and predicting where Glen was likely to go next. They noted that he always gravitated toward familiarity, bars that played loud music, neighborhoods where people didn't ask questions, motels where transient faces blended together. And most of all, he gravitated toward admiration, toward anyone who seemed impressed by him. It was no coincidence that the investigation focused on these environments. Meanwhile, Glen continued moving through the world as though the attention didn't apply to him. He changed appearances occasionally, but not enough to alter his demeanor, the part that had always made him recognizable. The confidence that once served him now marked him. He didn't avoid eye contact, he sought it. He didn't try to disappear, he attempted to dominate conversations. Even when he sensed suspicion, his instinct was to talk his way out rather than walk away. That compulsion became his undoing. One night, in a bar just off the interstate, he engaged a conversation that ran longer than it should have, and the woman across from him silently realized who he was. She didn't freeze or panic. She listened, nodded, and waited. As she memorized every detail, his truck, his jacket, the direction he walked when he stepped outside, her mind never betrayed her face. When she left the bar, she dialed law enforcement instantly. For the first time since the case began, officers were not reacting to where Glen had been. They were responding to where he was right now. Patrol cars spread across the grid of streets surrounding the bar. County and state agencies joined in silently, without tipping off the public. Police cruisers parked at intersections with engines running, waiting for the next update. The air inside every patrol vehicle was tense but quiet. No sirens, no lights, just steady breath and ready minds. When someone like Glen sensed pursuit, the chase could turn unpredictable fast, so officers worked with precision, focusing not on confrontation but containment. More importantly, they understood the psychology of a man who refused to believe his control of the world was slipping, someone who might act boldly rather than flee if cornered. For hours, the search remained just out of reach. There were reports of a truck matching his, then a similar description of a man at a convenience store, then the sound of an engine accelerating through the night. Each sighting was close enough to ignite adrenaline, but far enough to create doubt. But the net was tightening, and on some level, Glen knew. When he pulled into a motel outside town later that night, choosing the last room in the row the way he often did, he didn't know that investigators were already narrowing down their search patterns to the exact radius he had stopped in. What ended Chapter 10 was not a dramatic confrontation, but something quieter and more telling. For the first time in months, Glen didn't leave before sunrise. The road wasn't calling him anymore, or maybe, for the first time, he was too tired to answer. The man who used constant motion as his shield from reality had paused, and when a man like him pauses, everything that happens next becomes inevitable. Chapter 11. The Capture. when running was no longer enough. When Glen Rogers stopped moving, the world around him didn't. And that was the moment investigators had been waiting for, even if he hadn't realized it yet. The motel where he checked in that night looked like thousands across America. Peeling paint, humming soda machines, buzzing fluorescent signs. But there was something symbolic about the stillness of it, as if the life of running had reached a point where motion no longer protected him. The calm was deceptive, because just outside that bubble of quiet, an enormous invisible machine had begun turning. Law enforcement in multiple counties synchronized their movements, sharing surveillance grids, phoning updates that grew shorter and more urgent, marking his last known direction over maps that were now covered in red lines and circles. Glen, unaware, sat alone in his room, staring at a muted television where his own face flashed across the screen without him noticing. The volume was too low, and his mind was too loud. The same charisma that once made him feel untouchable had curdled into a restlessness that no longer resulted in admiration, only isolation. While he drifted between nervous pacing and exhausted silence, patrol units were called into position not with sirens, but with discipline. Plainclothes officers taking vantage points across the parking lot. Marked cruisers staged just far enough away to avoid alerting anyone inside. The strategy was patience, not force. They knew that a man who built his identity around control would respond unpredictably if startled. So the objective was simple. Wait until the odds were so overwhelmingly in their favor that Glen would have no direction left to run. The hours that followed were strangely quiet. Officers watching a door that never opened, radios crackling only with coded check-ins, motel guests going about their nights unaware that history was unfolding a few walls away. Even the air felt heavy, like the tension of an orchestra waiting for the conductor's first cue. And inside that small, dim room, Glen seemed to feel something too, not in a dramatic revelation, but in the subtle way his energy shifted. He sat longer without moving. He lit cigarettes without smoking them. He stared through the dusty window blinds at nothing at all, as though some part of him sensed that momentum had finally abandoned him. The moment of capture arrived not with a chase, nor a confrontation, but with an almost anticlimactic acceptance. When Glen stepped outside that morning, squinting against the rising sun with a bag slung over his shoulder, officers did not rush him suddenly. They simply emerged from multiple angles at once, forming a wall of presence that words could not break. There were commands, of course, but they were calm and controlled, delivered with the authority of people who already knew the outcome. For a split second, Glen's expression shifted. Not rage, not fear, but disbelief, as if the world had betrayed the script he'd been rehearsing since childhood, the script in which he was always the center of attention, always the one in control. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He lowered his gaze, dropped the bag, and allowed the handcuffs to close around his wrists with the quiet resignation of someone who finally understood that running was a performance that no longer had an audience. Word of the arrest spread faster than the arrest itself. Radios, phones, news desks, families who had waited months for closure, detectives who had pushed against exhaustion to reach this moment. Reporters swarmed the scene long after Glen was already being transported, eager to turn him into a headline again, to feed the public's hunger for a clean ending to a story built on fear. But endings are rarely clean. For law enforcement, this wasn't triumph, but transition. Now came the interrogations, the timelines, the charges, the confirmations of what they already suspected. Even during transport, Glen maintained that quiet duality, part defeated, part detached, eyes distant, posture loose. If there was fear within him, it never made it to the surface. If there was remorse, no one saw it. And yet, in the small details, the steady fidgeting with his fingers, the deep swallow before speaking, the way he occasionally stared at his reflection in the window rather than out of it, there were moments that suggested a profound internal conflict, as though he understood that everything he had built, every persona he had worn, was dissolving in real time. By the time officers escorted him into the station, the investigation had already accelerated past him. Teams were reviewing evidence, cross-referencing reports, matching timelines against multiple states, preparing to speak with families whose lives had been altered forever. For detectives, this chapter was not about celebration. It was about accuracy. What they needed most from Glen was clarity, admissions, details, confirmations, not for spectacle, but because the truth mattered to the people who had been waiting in the dark for answers. And as Glen sat under the harsh lighting of the interview room, hands cuffed to the table, he seemed to understand that silence was no longer power. He looked around the room almost analytically, as though he were measuring the distance between the man he pretended to be and the man the world now knew him as. When he finally spoke, the first words were not explosive or defensive, just quiet, steady, and without emotion. "I know why I'm here." With that sentence, the illusion of control he had lived behind for years gave way to inevitability, and Chapter 11 of his story closed not with drama, but with something far more haunting, the calm before the truth. Chapter 12. The Interrogation. A predator cornered by silence. The interview room felt too small for a man who had spent most of his life in motion, and that alone unsettled him. Glen Rogers sat handcuffed to the steel table, not because he was a danger in that moment, but because control had finally shifted away from him. And for a man whose entire identity revolved around controlling the people and spaces around him, that shift was more suffocating than any locked door. Across the table, detectives didn't try to intimidate him or match his energy. They did the opposite. They spoke softly, slowly, letting silence settle in after questions, the kind of silence that becomes more painful than confrontation. They studied him not as a brute, but as a performer, because performers crave applause, and applause comes only after someone speaks. They knew if they left enough room, Glen would eventually talk just to reclaim the spotlight. He tried to open with confidence at first, cracking small jokes, shrugging, leaning back in his chair as though this was just another temporary inconvenience he could charm his way past. But the room didn't give him that power. No smiles, no reactions, no emotional fuel, just a stillness that reflected him back at himself. The detectives didn't rush him. They laid out timelines, photographs, receipts, footprints of his life that even he couldn't escape. They didn't raise their voices or slam files down. They spoke with the quiet certainty of people who already knew the truth and were simply waiting to hear it in his voice. As the hours passed, Glen's demeanor shifted in small ways that would be invisible to someone who didn't understand him. A change in posture, a slight tremor in his fingers, a longer pause before answering. The fading enthusiasm in his attempts to tell stories that used to impress people. He wasn't frightened, he was disoriented. The script he had carried through life had stopped working. For the first time, his charm wasn't currency. His smiles were worth nothing. The detectives didn't argue with him when he lied. They simply let the lies fall to the floor like items dropped from trembling hands. When his stories contradicted each other, they didn't call them inconsistent. They quietly pointed out how many times he'd told a version of that story to bartenders, waitresses, customers, strangers who barely remembered him anymore. The world that once applauded his charisma had suddenly become the evidence that buried him. In a particularly telling moment, an investigator slid a thick stack of handwritten notes across the table, statements from people who once believed him, admired him, even trusted him. One by one, he realized those were now the voices that helped hunt him. The validation he chased his entire life had turned into footprints leading the police directly to him. But the interrogation didn't pivot on evidence. It pivoted when detectives shifted from what he did to who he needed to be. They didn't describe events. They described patterns. They didn't question motives. They exposed desires. They painted a picture of Glen's life as a constant pursuit of importance. A boy ignored, a teenager overlooked, a man who learned that attention could be stolen when it couldn't be earned. They said none of this with anger. They said it like facts in a biography. And that was what finally rattled him. Hearing someone else articulate the story he always told himself, but without granting him sympathy or heroism. When they told him he needed to feel admired, his jaw tightened. When they told him he believed people only valued him when he made them feel lucky to know him, a flicker crossed his eyes. When they said he could not handle rejection, that rejection turned the world into an enemy he needed to conquer. Glen looked away for the first time. It was as if they had stepped inside the most private room of his mind and flipped the light switch. Eventually, the silence between questions grew so heavy that Glen began speaking not to defend himself, but to rewrite the story, to reclaim authorship of the narrative. His voice stayed calm, but his words began to wander, trying to shape himself into something mythic, powerful, unpredictable, feared. And the detectives let him talk. Every sentence became another thread tying him to the truth, another detail that closed the distance between possibility and certainty. There were no outbursts, no slammed fists, no dramatic confessions overhead lighting couldn't soften. There was only the slow erosion of self-deception, minute by minute, expression by expression, until the investigator quietly said, "You've been running from being ordinary your whole life." That was when Glen finally went still, not defeated, but emotionally revealed. Because behind the crimes, the aliases, the flirting, the bragging, the road trips, the endless adrenaline, that was the one truth he could never outrun. When detectives finally stood up and left the room, the door closing behind them, Glen didn't call after them. He didn't demand to speak again. He didn't ask to see a lawyer. He sat staring at the reflection of himself in the metal table, and something in his posture changed, not like a man caught, but like a man who suddenly realized the performance was over. Outside the interview room, officers and analysts moved quickly, matching every statement, every name, every date, every location, building the final picture that would follow him into court and history. But in that moment, Glen wasn't thinking about the future. He was thinking about the applause he would never hear again, the admiration that would never return, and the spotlight that had gone out forever. And that, not the handcuffs, not the evidence, not the consequences, was the moment he truly understood he wasn't in control anymore. The rest of his story was no longer his to shape. Chapter 13. Courtroom Theater. The spotlight he craved one last time. The courthouse felt nothing like the small interrogation room where Glen Rogers first confronted the collapse of his persona. Here, there were lights, cameras, whispers, and eyes fixed on him from every direction, and for a man who lived his entire life feeding on attention, this was the closest thing he had left to applause. As deputies escorted him inside, he carried himself with a posture that didn't match a man facing a lifetime behind bars, shoulders back, chin slightly lifted, eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for someone who still looked at him with fascination instead of fear. The courtroom was packed long before proceedings began. Reporters scribbling furiously into notepads, true crime enthusiasts leaning forward in their seats, families on the edges of emotional cliffs, their grief heavy enough to silence entire sections of the room. Prosecutors moved with quiet confidence, not fueled by theatrics, but by the weight of years of evidence. Timelines, witness accounts, travel records, financial patterns, handwriting analyses, and psychological reports woven into a narrative so complete that even Glen seemed to sense there was no escape from it. When testimony began, the tone wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was clinical, methodical, overwhelming in its organization. Investigators walked the jury through the sequence of events with steady voices, never raising them, never embellishing details, never giving Glen an opening to perform. They spoke of movements between states, of acquaintances who remembered him vividly one week and distantly the next, of patterns that repeated not by accident but by design, of behaviors that shifted as soon as he sensed admiration turning into doubt. Every detail chipped away at the myth he tried to build around himself. The myth of the irresistible charmer, the nomad above consequence, the misunderstood outsider whose life was shaped by destiny rather than choice. The prosecution didn't try to make him look monstrous. They made him look ordinary, predictable, desperate for significance. And that, more than anything, seemed to crack his composure. The defense attempted to counter by reframing Glen as a man lost to circumstance, a man shaped by hardship, trauma, instability, broken family ties, someone who never learned how to exist in a world that valued consistency over charisma. They suggested he drifted not out of malice, but out of emotional immaturity, that his need for validation came from wounds rather than cruelty. It was a narrative built to soften the image, and Glen occasionally nodded along to it, as if he wanted the jury to believe he was a victim of his own life story. But every time the defense tried to portray him as powerless, his ego betrayed him. A smirk when reporters looked his direction, a too-quick answer when the prosecution described moments that mirrored the identity he was ashamed to admit but deeply attached to. He wasn't just fighting for freedom. He was fighting for identity, for the right to be seen not as a mundane criminal, but as someone extraordinary, even in infamy. The most chilling moments weren't explosive confrontations between attorneys or emotional testimonies from witnesses. They were the quiet shifts in Glen's expression whenever someone described him in ways that stripped him of glamour. When a behavioral expert called him a man who learned to mimic charisma without ever understanding connection, Glen's jaw tensed. When a former acquaintance described him as the kind of person who acted like he was someone important because he didn't know who he really was, his eyes hardened. And when the prosecution finally labeled him as a predator motivated not by impulse, not by rage, but by ego, he looked away, as if he couldn't tolerate hearing the one truth he worked his entire life to avoid. He wasn't feared because he was powerful. He was feared because he was lost. The families watched with an emotional endurance that no courtroom could measure. They didn't look at him with curiosity or fascination. They looked at him with the unspoken understanding that no verdict could ever return what had been taken. Their presence, more than any file or testimony, unmasked him, because they served as living evidence of the destruction left behind when someone uses attention as oxygen. The jury noticed it too. When deliberations began, the courtroom exhaled for the first time in weeks, but Glen didn't. He watched every juror's face, searching for recognition, admiration, something that reinstated the persona he once commanded so easily. But the room no longer gave him that power. His era of control was over. When the jury returned, the courtroom felt weightless, as if reality were holding its breath. Glen sat upright, attempting stoicism, but his fingers tapped almost imperceptibly against the table's edge, the only tell of his internal voltage. The verdict was delivered clearly and with no room for interpretation, and as it echoed through the room, something inside him shifted, not like a man shocked by punishment, but like a performer whose show had concluded without applause. There were no outbursts, no pleas, no final monologue. Only the quiet realization that the world would never look at him the way he always needed it to. The deputies escorted him out, and for the first time, no one craned their neck to watch him leave. The lights didn't follow him. Cameras stayed pointed toward judge, the families, the attorneys, toward the people whose lives would continue. In that moment, Glen Rogers disappeared in the one way that finally mattered to him. Not physically, but socially. He wasn't fascinating anymore. He wasn't the center of attention. And for a man whose identity was built entirely on being seen, the verdict took something deeper than freedom. It took his relevance. The performance was over. The curtain had closed, and the audience had already turned away. Chapter 14. The Prison Years. Fame without an audience. Prison didn't begin with shouting or violence. It began with silence, the kind Glen Rogers had avoided his entire life. The metal doors closed behind him, and for the first time there were no strangers to charm, no women to impress, no bartenders to entertain, no mirrors to rehearse expressions in. The world that once rewarded him for confidence, jokes, and swagger was gone, replaced by a structure where every person already knew exactly who he was. In here, he didn't get to choose his identity. It was assigned to him the moment he stepped through the gates, not as a charming drifter or a magnetic mystery, but simply as another inmate. Some prisoners recognized him immediately from news coverage, and for a brief moment, he felt the spark of attention he craved, a whisper of his name across a dining hall, a passing stare that fed his ego. He leaned into it instinctively, speaking just a little louder when guards walked by, adjusting his posture when inmates looked his way, as if trying to recreate the persona that used to work so effortlessly for him on the outside. But fascination fades quickly inside prison walls. Once the novelty passed, the other inmates moved on with their routines, their alliances, their own histories. Glen was no longer the man the world was hunting. He was just another face in a place full of headlines. The rhythms of incarceration unsettled him far more than confinement itself. Everything was predictable, structured, and orderly, and predictability was the one thing he had spent his life running from. Breakfast at the same time every morning, the same schedules, the same voices echoing down the corridors, the same checklist of obligations and restrictions. There were no bars, no clubs, no neon lights, no excitement. Just routine. And routine left him alone with himself, which had always been the one person he was trying to escape. He tried to reinvent himself again, just as he had in bars and apartments across the country, telling embellished stories, adjusting details to make himself sound more important, more brilliant, more feared. But it didn't land the way he hoped. Prisoners had their own stories, their own survival strategies, their own identities, and none of them were impressed by a man trying to sell a fantasy. Every time he tried to portray himself as a legend, they saw a man who didn't know who he was without an audience. For the first time in his life, he couldn't control how people saw him. So he shifted his performance inward instead of outward. He read newspapers obsessively, following even the smallest mention of his name. He memorized every detail of his coverage, every headline, every documentary rumor, as if those words confirmed that he still mattered beyond the walls. When reporters didn't mention him for weeks, he became irritable and withdrawn. When an article resurfaced, he lit up with a pride he didn't bother to hide. It didn't matter if the attention came with criticism or condemnation. As long as someone was still talking about him, he felt alive. But slowly, inevitably, the world moved on. New cases took the spotlight. Other criminals became the subject of nightly news and true crime debates. The name Glen Rogers appeared less and less frequently, and no matter how hard he tried to pretend otherwise, he noticed. His entire life had been built around the rush of being noticed, the validation of being wanted, romantically, socially, dangerously, and prison was a place where anonymity spread like a fog. The staff, unlike the outside world, didn't treat him with fascination or fear. They treated him with policies and procedures. They didn't flinch when he postured. They didn't soften when he tried to charm. They didn't react when he tried to provoke. They treated him no differently from anyone else in his block, and that indifference cut deeper than any confrontation. At night, when the noise of the day settled and the hallways quieted, he lay awake replaying memories of road trips, laughter, flattery, crowded rooms, and admiring eyes. He replayed conversations from bars where people believed he was extraordinary. He replayed moments when someone looked at him like he was the most captivating person in the room. In prison, those memories weren't souvenirs, they were fuel. He held on to them because they were proof that his life once felt bigger than it really was. As time passed, Glen developed a kind of nostalgia for himself, not for the things he had done, but for the version of himself he once pretended to be. He missed the myth more than the life. The confident drifter, the unpredictable charmer, the man who could walk into any city and become whoever he wanted. That fantasy was gone, replaced by a version of him that the world had defined instead, not mysterious, not glamorous, not larger than life. Just a man whose need to be special had swallowed everything else. The years blurred quietly, and the distance between who he once pretended to be and who he truly was grew wider. Some inmates were released. Some were transferred. Some faded. Glen remained. The longer he stayed, the more it became clear that the real punishment wasn't confinement, it was irrelevance. And so the days stretched on, each identical to the last. There were no more headlines, no more photos, no more crowds. Just silence, routine, and the echo of a lifetime spent chasing something that never existed. The mask that once worked so well had no place here. The persona had no audience. The performance had no applause. The legend had become a whisper, then a rumor, then nothing at all. And in the stillness of that realization, Glen Rogers faced the one fate he had spent his entire life running from, being forgotten. Chapter 15, The Final Silence, a legacy built on illusion. There was no dramatic end for Glen Rogers, no final spectacle, no sudden surge of attention he once believed was his destiny. Just the slow, quiet fading of a man who had lived his entire life trying to be noticed. In the outside world, new crimes captured headlines. New names became the center of documentaries, and the public's memory shifted as it always does, leaving Rogers behind not as a mystery or a legend, but as a moment the world had already processed and moved beyond. In prison, he grew older in ways that had nothing to do with wrinkles or gray hair. It was the weight of time settling into his voice, the exhaustion behind his eyes, the steady realization that the persona he built could no longer protect him from obscurity. The image he once held of himself, the charismatic drifter who could hypnotize strangers and rewrite his own identity at will, became more myth than memory, a story he silently replayed not because he believed it anymore, but because it was all he had left of the man he wished he had been. The copies of old newspaper clippings he treasured began to yellow. The documentaries he hoped would revive attention shifted focus to other figures. The fan letters that once trickled and slowed, then stopped altogether. Prison didn't break Glen's body. It erased his reflection. The silence he once feared eventually became routine, and the applause he chased all his life faded into nothing more than the echo of a performance no one was watching anymore. In the end, what remained wasn't the thrill of the chase or the fantasy of danger, but the small, undeniable truth that the attention he spent a lifetime craving was never truly admiration. It was curiosity, fear, and spectacle disguised as validation. He became not a legend, not an antihero, not the larger-than-life figure he imagined, but a cautionary tale about ego, insecurity, and the empty places people will go when they spend their lives performing rather than living. And long after he stopped speaking, stopped explaining, stopped acting, the world simply continued, untouched by his disappearance, unmoved by his memory. Years later, when the name Glen Rogers resurfaced occasionally in crime discussions, it was not with fascination, but with distance, a footnote in a history full of louder monsters. He left no mystery unsolved, no myth unbroken, no legacy worth celebrating. Just a quiet warning that sometimes the most dangerous people are not those who hide in the shadows, but those who want so desperately to be seen that they will burn everything and everyone to maintain the illusion of importance. And as the world slept, unaware that another day had passed without his name spoken, Glen Rogers reached the one destination he had spent his entire life running from. Not death, not justice, but being forgotten. Chapter 15. The Final Silence, a legacy built on illusion. In the end, Glen Rogers did not leave the world in a blaze of infamy or triumph. He faded quietly into the background, his story dissolving the way a rumor dissolves when no one repeats it. As the world steadily shifted its attention to new names, new headlines, and new confusions, leaving him not as the myth he once hoped to become, but as a distant footnote in the ever-expanding archive of American true crime. Outside the prison walls, the fascination that once surged around his capture and courtroom appearances turned into the faintest echo. Journalists moved on to fresher stories. Networks pivoted to killers with more dramatic narratives, and investigators who once poured hours into tracking him across multiple states retired, were reassigned, or simply stopped thinking about him. Over time, Rogers's case became something forensic analysts discussed only when training recruits on how impulsive offenders behave differently from methodical ones, how charisma can distract witnesses, how confidence can mask instability, and how law enforcement learned to compare missing persons across jurisdictions rather than treating each city like its own isolated world. In those lectures, his name was spoken not with intrigue or awe, but with the steady, clinical tone of a case study. Useful, not memorable. Detectives who had once felt the adrenaline of the multi-state chase reflected years later in interviews, saying things like, "Rogers reminded us that most monsters don't look like monsters," or "he was good at performing a role, until he wasn't anymore." Short quotes buried inside articles no one printed on their refrigerator or framed as relics of the past. Prosecutors later admitted they had expected Rogers to become a long, lasting icon of fear, the way others before him had turned into cultural references or household names, but the prediction never manifested. Psychologically, his unpredictability and charm made him frightening in the moment, yet strangely forgettable with distance, perhaps because his persona had always been borrowed rather than born, assembled from the attention of others like a collage instead of something genuine. When true crime documentaries revived his name on occasion, the tone was noticeably different from the sensational coverage of the 1990s. Instead of painting him as a mysterious drifter or seductive con artist, modern filmmakers framed him as a warning about the consequences of fragmented record, keeping, and the dangers of underestimating individuals who appear socially competent despite deep instability beneath the surface. In academic journals, criminal psychologists used him not as a profile of calculated predation, but as an example of identity-driven pathology, a man who did not kill to hide, retaliate, or dominate in the traditional sense, but rather because violence briefly made him feel exceptional, seen, if only for a moment. They described him as someone addicted not to power over others, but to validation from them, someone who spent his life trying to convince the world and himself that he mattered. One behavior science panel described him as a man whose crimes were driven not by rage or greed, but by the terror of insignificance, a sentence that critics of the report called too poetic for a clinical study. Yet the description struck something honest, even if it was uncomfortable. It highlighted the thing Rogers could never outrun, that every performance he gave, every exaggerated story, every borrowed identity, every boastful lie told in bars or motels, was a shield against a frightening emptiness inside him. Years later, when documentaries interviewed surviving investigators, the detectives spoke not about a mastermind or a criminal genius, but about a man who became dangerous because he lived in fantasy rather than reality. They explained his ability to mirror the personalities of strangers, his skill in blending into nightlife scenes, and his instinct for identifying those who responded positively to attention. They emphasized that his danger came from his adaptability, his mutability, not from strategy, but from constant reinvention without self-awareness. One retired officer reflected, "He acted like he was the star of his own movie, but real life isn't a movie. Eventually, real life catches up." Another added that Rogers' unraveling later in life wasn't caused by escalating violence, but by the collapse of his illusions. His fantasies could no longer keep pace with reality, and when he could no longer pretend to be admired, respected, or envied, he chased attention any way he could. As psychologists and investigators reshaped the narrative surrounding him, true crime authors also revised their tones. Early writers had painted him as a shadowy seducer, the Casanova Killer, the man who drifted across the highways of America, leaving chaos in his wake. But modern authors approached him not as an enigma, but as a warning about glamorizing offenders. They pointed out that many early articles amplified his own self-mythology by using the language of thrillers, referring to him as charming, handsome, mysterious, when in truth, his charisma worked only on those who were vulnerable, lonely, or eager to believe someone larger than life had taken an interest in them. Later memoirs by people who had known him in passing described him not with fascination, but with confusion, a man who talked big, spent money he didn't have, and seemed constantly one step away from both triumph and disaster. Some remembered him smiling wide, laughing loud, and drinking hard. Others remembered the moment the performance broke, the flash of insecurity in his eyes when a story didn't land, the sudden irritation when attention drifted away from him. It became evident that the persona he wore was fragile, stitched together by desperation. The internet era, which turned so many criminals into digital folklore, barely preserved Rogers. Forums debated him briefly, then turned toward figures whose crimes fit pop culture narratives more neatly. Podcasts covered him occasionally, but his episodes never ranked among their highest numbers. YouTube documentaries that mentioned him saw steady but modest views. His name never reached the macabre celebrity status of other offenders whose cases became cultural obsessions. Instead, he existed somewhere in between, remembered by specialists, barely recognized by casual viewers, a ghost of a case that mattered intensely for a moment and then slipped quietly out of mainstream memory. And for someone who once lived as if attention were oxygen, being unnoticed was perhaps the truest punishment fate could have chosen for him. Inside prison, Glen aged in parallel to this fading legacy. When a new documentary or article resurfaced briefly, he would hear whispers among inmates or see headlines passed around the rec yard. Each time, he sat up straighter during roll call, spoke louder in visitation rooms, or crafted new anecdotes to impress anyone who might still listen. But every revival faded faster than the last. Eventually, the outside world stopped revisiting his name except in rare retrospectives about the 1990s crime panic or the evolution of interstate investigations. Researchers documented his case in textbooks not because he was extraordinary, but because he embodied the pattern of impulsive criminals who move frequently to avoid responsibility rather than to execute strategy. Law enforcement schools used his case to teach how agencies share data, and victim advocacy groups cited him as evidence that marginalized victims deserve the same urgency and resources as all others. In time, Glen Rogers existed primarily in academic literature and archive case files. His identity was fixed not by the persona he spent his life performing, but by the reality he tried to escape. A deeply insecure drifter whose need to feel significant led to destruction rather than recognition. He was not remembered as a mastermind, not as a mystery, not as a legend, but as a warning. And when the final years of his life slipped by, marked by the slow erosion of attention rather than the sudden shock of notoriety, the world did not pause to revisit his name or reconsider his place in history. Instead, crime historians noted that the true lesson of Glen Rogers was not about violence, but about illusion. The illusion that image can replace identity, that attention can replace purpose, that fame, of any kind, can fill a void that no one else can see. When his story reemerged in later decades, it was stripped of mystique and glamour. It existed only as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people are not those who lurk unseen, but those who want so desperately to be seen that they will destroy anything in their path. And as the world continued to move forward, unaware that another day had passed without his name spoken aloud, Glen Rogers finally reached the destination he feared most. Not infamy, not justice, but absolute obscurity.